Let's talk about this IVF story because I think this is not going to go away within the span of a couple of days. It's truly a disturbing story. And if you're not familiar with it, let me give you some background and then we'll talk about the implications of it all. The story as it goes is that between 2013 and 2016, there were three sets of parents in Alabama who went through in vitro fertilization. They did the treatments, hoping it would lead to the birth of a child. And I'm not an expert on IVF, but in general, the way it goes is there's some surgery involved because they have to extract the egg from the uterus, from the woman, and then they fertilize the egg, and hopefully they'll fertilize several eggs. They can assess which ones have the best chance of becoming a baby, and they implant that fertilized egg back into the uterus, and hopefully it leads to the birth of a child. And that is what happened in this case. Some of the embryos were implanted into the patient's bodies, and it did lead to successful births. I apologize if I said anything medically inaccurate there. Here's the important part, though. The fertilized eggs that were not used, those embryos, they were frozen and kind of saved for later. This is important. This happens all the time because sometimes you implant the fertilized egg back in the body and it doesn't take and it doesn't work out and it's frustrating. What do you want to do at that point? Do you want to do another surgery? No, you go back to the fertilized eggs you already had and say, all right, let's try again with a different one. And that's emotionally draining enough as is. But that idea of having several eggs fertilized, freezing them for later use in case something doesn't work, in case the parents want to come back later and they want another child, well, guess what? We've already done the surgery. We have these available for us. That's normal. So that's what happened in this case. Some of these embryos were implanted into the patient's bodies. They had successful births. The rest of those embryos were placed in a, quote, cryogenic nursery at a place called the Center for Reproductive Medicine. They were frozen there until further notice. Here's where it gets weird. In 2020, a patient at the hospital that houses that fertility clinic, that person somehow got access to the fertility clinic via an unsecured doorway. And he got access to the freezer where they kept all these embryos. And then he took them out. And imagine you go into your freezer at home and pull something out. It's freezing. Well, these are even colder than that. So he must have been shocked and he dropped whatever he pulled out of the freezer and he destroyed those embryos. So those three sets of parents eventually sued the Center for Reproductive Medicine and the group overseeing it. And they said it was the hospital's negligence that led to the destruction of their embryos. And importantly, they said that was not just a mistake and we're mad at the hospital. They said that violated the Alabama Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. This is key. To put that another way, they sued the hospital for killing their babies, basically saying that life begins at conception. And Alabama has a law that punishes people who wrongfully kill a minor. But the question is, if it's a frozen embryo, is it a minor? Is that the same thing? Well, a circuit court judge in 2022 said, you guys, we're talking about frozen embryos. Those are not children. Those are not the same thing. So she tossed out the case. So then these plaintiffs appealed the decision, and the Alabama Supreme Court this week overturned that ruling. They voted 7-2 and said embryos are minor children and that unborn children fall under the umbrella of minor child, and that therefore the families have every right to sue the clinic under that law. So important to note, the families have not won their case. They just now can move forward with their case. But these Supreme Court justices in Alabama, every single one of which was appointed by a Republican governor, they said, yeah, unborn children count as children. But the thing I really want to show you, by the way, let me show you this. This is the actual law they are talking about. you could see wrongful death of a minor. And this is the important bit highlighted. When the death of a minor child is caused by the wrongful act, omission, or negligence of any person, the personal representative of the minor may commence an action. That's what these plaintiffs were doing. They're saying, well, our minor child was killed by this hospital, so we're coming after them. And the Supreme Court of Alabama just gave them the green light to do it. But the thing that I really need to show you is not the decision, because you may have heard about this decision in the news, because it effectively says we can't do IVF treatments in Alabama because the way we do IVF treatments is we keep the frozen embryos, but if the family doesn't want them, if they get destroyed as they did, well, we discard them. Or maybe we donate them to a science lab or something, but they get destroyed ultimately. And if the Supreme Court of Alabama is saying you can't do that, it's murder, what would a fertility lab or an infertility clinic, like, what would they do at this point? They can't house these embryos forever. What happens if the parents say, yeah, we're done having kids? We had one, we had two, we're good now. What do they do with the remaining embryos? They apparently cannot destroy them because the Supreme Court says that's murder. So are they supposed to keep them indefinitely? What if the parents whose eggs those are, what if they die and they have children and grandchildren? Like, how long are you supposed to hold on to these embryos at that point? Like, at some point, the ruling says you got to hold on to these indefinitely, which takes a lot of money for storage. And who's going to pay for that? Because it's not cheap. So, like, there's a lot of ramifications here. Already, as I say this, I think there were 5 fertility clinics in Alabama, and like 2 or 3 of them have already said, we are hitting pause on IVF treatments. We're not doing them. If you already had your embryos removed, well, guess what? You're not getting them put in you because we're not doing any IVF treatments right now. It's just a horrible, messed up decision. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I told you it's a 7-2 decision by the Alabama Supreme Court. Well, one of those 7, one of the people in the majority also actually happened to be the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Tom Parker. And instead of just saying, yeah, I agree with the majority, he said, yeah, I agree with the majority, but I want to offer my own reasoning as to why I agree with the majority. And his thing was crazy. Let me show you some of what he wrote, Tom Parker. This is part of his concurrence. And just look at this. This is page 37 of this document. In summary, the theologically based view of the sanctity of life adopted by the people of Alabama encompasses the following. This is what all of Alabama believes. Okay, number 1, God made every person in his image. That's just a fact, you guys. That's what everyone in Alabama believes. Number 2, each person, therefore, has a value that far exceeds the ability of human beings to calculate, says a guy who probably thinks the world is 6,000 years old. And number 3, human life cannot be wrongfully destroyed without incurring the wrath of a holy God who views the destruction of his image as an affront to himself. Like, what the hell? Section 36.06, that law we were talking about, recognizes that this is true of unborn human life no less than it is all other human life. That even before birth, all human beings bear the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory. Like, none of that belongs in any judicial decision ever. He's basically saying, I agree with the legal decision that embryos are people, but also let's make sure everybody knows that the reason that's true is because the Lord my God in my favorite book said so, and you can't question it, and that's how I decide the law. It's whatever my favorite book in my book club says, and I don't care about what the rest of you think. Like, why is his personal religion the basis for this decision at all? Why couldn't he just say, yeah, I agree with the legal basis, whatever the other dude said? No, he's like, I don't care what he said. Embryos are people because God said so in my interpretation of this book. That is seriously messed up. And then at the very end of his statement, at the very end of his concurrence, he wrote one other thing I want to share with you. Again, this is now page 48. He went on for a while. The people of Alabama have declared the public policy of this state to be that unborn human life is sacred. We believe that each human being from the moment of conception is made in the image of God, created by him to reflect his likeness. Don't forget the capital letter H in his and him. It is as if the people of Alabama took what was spoken of the prophet Jeremiah and applied it to every unborn person in this state. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. Oh my God, no one cares. Why are you citing the Bible in your decision? But the people in this case, small as they were, would be unacceptable. Carving out an exception for the people in this case, small as they were, would be unacceptable for the people of this state, who have required us to treat every human being in accordance with the fear of a holy God. Oh my God, I don't care. Notice that he uses we. Again, he just makes it out to be like every single person in Alabama is totally on board with him. They supported this law. They supported the legislators who passed this law. Therefore, we're all in 100% agreement. It is such a messed up way to defend a horrible, horrible decision. Like, nothing says rule of law like citing personal mythology as justification for your extremist interpretation of the law. And yet, in stories I have seen about this IVF case, that Christian privilege did not get a ton of coverage as much as like the decision itself. Because if a non-Christian judge used that type of reasoning for anything, it would be the only focus of the story, I would think. So that part is messed up. By the way, Tom Parker, the guy who wrote that, I just want to show you this screenshot here. This is Tom Parker. Look at the title. This is from Sean Foyt, the Christian nationalist guitar player who was like a COVID super spreader back in the day. He writes, Chief Justice Tom Parker welcomes Sean Foyt and let us worship to Alabama. Tom Parker, that Chief Justice, is the dude in the hat in the middle. Sean Foyt is the other dude in the hat next to him. But that's who Tom Parker is. He's a Christian nationalist who is using his Christian nationalism now to justify a horrible decision. By the way, I'm sure some of you have noted this in the comments. This is the very same Supreme Court, the super pro-life Supreme Court, that recently decided they would execute a man using nitrogen hypoxia, which is an experimental method that was never used before. And according to news reports about that execution, it was a disaster. This Supreme Court, this pro-life Supreme Court, is all for the death penalty. I should note, Tom Parker dissented in that particular decision, but 6 of his colleagues were fine with it. But still, like, they're not pro-life. They're just pro-fetus. Whatever hurts women, that's what they're for. So the effects of this ruling cannot be overstated. Because if they are shutting, I'll get to that question in a second. But if the 5 main fertility clinics in Alabama can now be sued over embryos that are not implanted, they're probably just going to shut down altogether. That means the clinics are going to close, shutting out everyone who wanted IVF, which includes plenty of religious people who are infertile or can't have kids the natural way for whatever reason. It also means all those doctors who are experts in doing the treatments, they might have to move to another state that actually welcomes them. And I think the more pressing concern is this stuff does not stay in Alabama. The Republican Party has nationally has said over and over they are the party of the unborn. They think this ruling would be fine. They've been saying this forever, that we got to ban abortion nationally. We don't want blue states to be allowed to have it. Like, states' rights don't matter if blue states are allowed to have abortions. They want a federal ban on abortion. That would also apply to IVF. This is something pro-life groups have been saying forever. Like, they don't like surrogacy. They don't like IVF treatments. They want to ban it altogether. They think it amounts to murder. This is not a fringe group of people. This is the Republican Party. And yet, in the wake of this decision, the Republican Party is telling all of its people, stop saying you're opposed to IVF. Say, it should not be left up to judges. It should be left up to other people. And I'm fine with IVF. And like, they're just hypocrites now, which is, I don't get what their position is anymore, because this is what they wanted all along. You know how after the Dobbs decision happened and abortion was banned in a bunch of states, and you started hearing in Texas and Mississippi all these horror stories of like 10-year-old, 12-year-old rape victims needing an abortion, having to cross state lines to get an abortion, or women with ectopic pregnancies who need an abortion but couldn't get it. And all these Republicans are like, well, that's not what we wanted. That's not what we were saying. It's like, yeah, no, we've been telling everybody that's exactly what you've been saying for decades now, because these people, it's like the dog finally caught the car and now they don't know what to do with it. They never think about the ramifications of what they want. And this is a perfect example of that. For all these years, they've been saying IVF is bad. It amounts to murder. Embryos are people, all this sort of BS. And now it happened, and everyone's freaking out because they didn't think it would actually happen. Republicans like saying this stuff because it's good for the base, it's good for elections, it's good for fundraising. But in terms of policy, they don't like it. They know it's bad. And they just never cared because they never thought they would actually achieve it. And now that they have, because they got what they wanted, now they're trying to run away from it, because it turns out liberals were right all along. All the people they were declaring as hysterical were right. By the way, the Medical Association of the state of Alabama, in a brief to the Alabama Supreme Court before this decision, they laid out exactly what would happen if this decision came to pass. They said, let me show you, let me make sure I'm quoting this accurately. Here we go. Boom. This is from the Medical Association of Alabama. The potential detrimental impact on IVF treatment in Alabama cannot be overstated. The increased exposure to wrongful death liability, as advocated by the appellants, would, at best, substantially increase the costs associated with IVF. More ominously, the increased risk of legal exposure might result in Alabama's fertility clinics shutting down and fertility specialists moving to other states, which is what I mentioned earlier. And look at this other part down here. Parents pay to store unused embryos, but sometimes embryos are destroyed or donated for research if there are genetic problems or if they are unlikely to develop normally in utero. Requiring fertility clinics to store all unused embryos forever would push up the costs for patients. I also heard people say this too, like banning abortion, it hurts the poor, but banning IVF hurts the rich, because it costs $10,000 to $30,000 like to do a successful implantation. I hope I have those numbers right. That's not something most people can afford to do. And when you're hurting the rich people, now you're hurting people the Republicans need. And so they don't want this to go through for that reason either. So what else was there to say about this? I should point out, this is not an unusual position. Again, I want to repeat, Republicans have been doing this for years. This is something I talked about on this show a while ago. But there was an Oklahoma Senate candidate last year. His name is Dusty Devers, and he is in the state Senate now in Oklahoma. But this is what he said in a sermon that was uncovered from 2022. Look at the rhetoric he's using here. Why should this matter to you? Oh, he talks about the harsh realities of IVF. Why should this matter to you? Well, we've heard why it should matter. Millions of our embryonic neighbors unnecessarily are being led to slaughter every year by IVF and assisted reproductive technologies. And countless others are cryo-incarcerated in frozen prisons. We are creating cryo-orphans for the sake of biological offspring. Like, this was a thing he said with a straight face in 2022, and now he's in a position of power in Oklahoma. And I don't remember if I talked about this, but this was another story. There was a Florida woman who was trying to run a self-help seminar, and she decided to rent out space at a Catholic church in Florida. And they looked her up and they said, wait, you talk a lot about how you had kids through IVF, and we're the Catholic Church, and so we don't like it. So we're not allowing you to rent out any space from us. Like, this anti-IVF stuff has been happening forever. And I should also say it's really unpopular. This is from the Pew Research Center. This is, look at the date on this, 2013. It's a decade old, but it's like the most recent thing I could find. The new survey finding shows that the percentage of US adults who consider abortion to be morally wrong is 49%. And that far exceeds the percentage that expresses this view about IVF, 12%. In 2013, only 12% of American adults said IVF was immoral, but that is now the position of the Republican Party. That is the position of the Supreme Court of Alabama. And they're not going to stop with Alabama. I cannot say this enough. If the Republican Party wins in November and they get the trifecta they need in Washington, D.C., they will try to not just ban abortion and do a blanket federal ban across the country. They will try to make IVF illegal. It is what the craziest people in their base want. And in fact, a right-wing legal group, the right-wing legal group Liberty Counsel, put this out this week. Alabama Supreme Court rules frozen embryos are children. And then look at what they say here. Using this precedent, Liberty Counsel filed a supplemental authority today with the Florida Supreme Court regarding a proposed abortion amendment to Florida's Constitution. Liberty Counsel is using Alabama's ruling to argue that Florida's Constitution, like Alabama's, affirms that an unborn child qualifies as a human life, a human being, and a person. And then they have a portrait of a person. That's a person to them. They're trying to get the Alabama Supreme Court's decision to influence what's happening in Florida, so they ban it there too. It's not going to stop in red states either. Again, if Republicans win, it doesn't matter what they say now in front of the camera, because they will say, I'm against IVF. Like, that's what they're doing right now. They will get in front of cameras and say, well, I don't agree with the decision. I support IVF. A lot of people in my church have used IVF. The follow-up should be, well, do you think embryos are people? Do you think unborn fetuses are children? They're going to have to, I hope they get asked that, because they don't have a good answer to that. And they shouldn't, because it's hypocritical. But this is what has to happen. Doesn't matter what they say, they would support a ban on abortion, and that applies to IVF as well. So this is not a fringe view anymore. This is happening everywhere. It is scary. And again, like I showed you earlier, one of those justices is so cocky about his position on that court right now that he literally added in a concurrence that said, not only are we right, my Bible's God tells me I'm right, and therefore that should apply to everyone in the state. It is absolutely insane. It should be horrifying. And all the more reason, I mean, if you were thinking you're frustrated with Democrats, so you're going to sit out during the election, well, then this is what you're supporting by not voting for Democrats to put a stop to this sort of stuff. All right, I'll stop there. Let's take some questions about this, because it's scary stuff. I got a lot of comments start. Oh boy. All right, let's get to them. I'll go fast. If embryos have personhood, the parents need to claim those embryos on taxes. I know I've seen people joking about this. I've seen already political cartoons saying like, yeah, I got 26 dependents over here. But this is the logical extension of crazy Republican policies. Like, how many kids do you have? What happens if a frozen embryo is stored away for like 18 years? Are Republicans going to try to get that thing to fight a war? Like, what happens as these frozen embryos get older? When does the birthday start? Does it start from the date of conception or the date it comes out of the womb? Like, I want to know the answer. They don't have answers to them. But no doubt, again, we got to go through the consequences of this sort of decision, and none of these conservatives have thought it through. This will have dire consequences. Absolutely. And we're talking about those right now. I agree. And that's what's scary. Unborn children is not a thing. Hey, my imaginary friends are very real. How dare you? So if when the procedure doesn't work? Is that murder now? I mean, this is a fair question. Like, is miscarriage murder? Because that's an accident. I mean, it's not like anyone did that on purpose, but so is like some dude knocking over the embryos in the freezer. I agree that the hospital, they deserve to be punished for their negligence because they let some dude get access to the frozen cryo chamber thing. The hospital did not do that correctly. They should be punished. But using the punishment that says, let's just stop IVF, that's insane. So, I mean, this is a fair question. If you're saying embryos are children, then what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if a parent wants to implant another embryo? What does that first one count as murder? Again, they haven't thought this stuff through. Somehow there are plenty of Catholics who use IVF despite what the Catholic Church says. There are plenty of evangelical Christians who get IVF done despite what they believe about abortion. So like none of these people are consistent. But they haven't thought this through. They don't seem to think it's murder. And yet, what else we got? Here's the thing. When they freeze fertilized eggs for storage, they're not even an embryo. It's still a clump of undifferentiated cells called blastocysts, so it's not even an embryo yet. But it could be. And I want to make this distinction clear. Because I've seen people joking about this. They're like, what are sperm banks going to be shut down? What if a woman donates her egg? Are they going to try to make masturbation a crime? Something like that. And the thing is, no, because it's the fertilization that counts for them. And as soon as they're fertilized, even like Belinda is saying here, even though it's not an embryo, it could be, but it's not there yet. Doesn't matter. As soon as it goes like that, they're like, that's a human child right there. Don't make it, it doesn't make sense. Don't try to make it make sense. How long do embryos even last in cryogenic storage? I don't have a good answer for you. Anything I say would be made up. But apparently it could be several years because these families have gone back. Let's say they implanted one embryo and it worked and they had a child. Then a few years down the road, they decide, I want to have another one. They can go back to what was stored in those freezers. I don't know how long it lasts. Maybe some of you know in the comments, but I'm not going to try to answer because I don't know the answer. Seth Meyers had a good observation. Anti-abortion laws insist people be parents. IVF, with this new Alabama ruling, would prevent people who want to be parents from being parents. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Let me see if I can make sense of that one more time. By forcing people to have kids against their will, they're forcing people to be parents. And yet, this Alabama law, you're taking parents who wanted to have a child. That's why they went through IVF, but you're shutting them off from being able to do it. Like, what is it that these conservatives want? Do you want people to be able to have babies or not? Make a choice. All I want to know is why they stop caring about children once they are born. Yeah, I wish I knew, but that's the GOP's platform, so that's the way it is. What's the old George Carlin line? If you're preborn, you're fine. If you're preschool, you're fucked. Something like that. Women are born with more eggs than they will ever use. So when women die without using all their eggs, do Christians think all women are murderers then? I mean, probably. They already think if they're wearing shorts, they're harlots. If God is creating these unborn children, why do we have to do all the work in a lab? Man. Seriously, if God wanted these people to have babies, he should have made them fertile. But also, like, kudos to science. We figured out how to do it and help people who couldn't otherwise have kids do it. That's an incredible achievement. It's like the COVID vaccine, it's a miracle of science. And what do the most conservative religious people do? They're so mad about it. They don't like it one bit. It's infuriating. So if embryos are children, do we count their age from the day of fertilization? So some kids are 5 years old when they're born. I'm telling you, they haven't thought this stuff through. Because, yeah, if you've been frozen forever, why are we counting your birthday from the day you're born? I would like to know that. I just Googled this. The longest that human embryos, thank you, Spencer, have been stored is up to 30 years. Many scientists theorize that embryos could be stored indefinitely. So we could have like 1,000-year-old embryo just sitting around being thawed out, put in somebody a while from now, that would be amazing. Let's do it. We'll do a fundraiser. The Republicans are dragging this shit around because the evangelicals are dragging it around. The evangelicals are dragging it around because the Republicans asked them to several decades ago. Man, I'll talk about this more next week, but white evangelicals wanted their school segregation so badly that they mobilized like this pretend persecution so they could keep their segregated schools. And when they realized this is probably not going to be a good winning argument for us, they shifted to abortion. And ever since, they realized this is good for us because there are abortion rights. So we can keep saying it's bad and this is never going to go away. We'll fundraise off of this. We'll win elections. And then they got everything they wanted. And it turns out everything is horrible. And I hope Republicans suffer in November as a result of this. I hope every Democrat, I don't care if you're running for school board, every Democrat, every liberal should be running off of you can read what you want. I'm not trying to ban your books. I'm not going to get in front of your legs. I'm not going to ban abortion. Like, Republicans want to control your freedom. And I'm going to be the pro-freedom side. That should be every Democrat's position forever. Nice of them to make these kinds of rulings during an election year, keeping the issue fresh and in the news. No kidding. It is kind of nice to see Republicans on the defensive for something they totally deserve instead of Democrats on the defensive for whatever made-up charge Republicans are sending their way. My background is Jewish. In Judaism, life is seen at the point of first breath. They are imposing Christian belief on the rest of us. No kidding. There are more stories like that coming up too.